Over 400,000 people in China have lost access to their money since banks are running out of money and are on the brink of bankruptcy. And that's the official number. If we dig deeper, the number is most likely higher. When you put your money in the bank, you expect the bank to pay you some interest. Ideally, the bank would lend your money to someone else and collect higher interest. Interest rates on saving accounts, for example, are around 1%. While credit card rates at around 20%. The difference after paying you is the profit that the bank's supposed to make. However, when you check your bank account, it still says that your money is there in the bank and you can withdraw it whenever you want. And that's because of a system we have called fractional reserved banking. Banks are allowed to just keep 10% of their money and lend out the rest. So if your bank account shows that your money is still there, it's actually not. That's not a problem when the economy is doing great. People don't often withdraw all of their savings overnight, especially if it's millions of dollars. A bank is where you hide your money, especially considering the minimal interest they pay you, which is usually significantly lower than inflation. But the moment people feel that their money isn't safe in the bank, they would rush to the banks to withdraw their savings. But because of fractional reserve banking, the banks won't be able to pay people, causing the banks to go bankrupt. 4,000 banks in China are on the verge of going bankrupt. Even if a fraction of those banks collapses, the consequences could be devastating, since that could push the economy into a crisis that would lead the entire economy to collapse. And that's just one side of the problem. The other side is the housing crash that China is facing that we have discussed in the previous video. China banks may face a $350 billion in losses from property crises. S&P Global Rating estimates that 2.4 trillion yuan or $356 billion or 6.4% of mortgages are at risk, while Deutsche Bank AG is warning at least 7% of home loans are in danger. The property market is the foundation of China's economy, which seems like it's about to burst. The government is spending hundreds of billions of dollars to save it, but can only soften the crisis and not avoid it. Even if China somehow through some miracle saves its real estate market, it is far from over. Will China's economy survive the next 6 months is a big question. Why exactly is China's economy about to crash? And why are investors such as Cathie selling off their shares and leaving China for good? We will answer all of these questions and many more, but before we do that, give this video a thumbs up and let's dive in. Despite China's rich history, for the past couple of centuries, China has suffered at the hands of foreign invaders such as Europe and Japan. And for the better part of the 20th century, the country was impoverished to the point where millions could not afford to put food on the table. In just a few years, from 1959 to 1961, 15 to 55 million died due to starvation. After a few decades of the Chinese Great Famine, Deng Xiaoping rose to power and changed the entire ideology of China. China was isolated, it didn't trade with the world and looked at it with much of skepticism. But Deng Xiaoping decided to open the country to foreigners and created special economic zones where foreign companies could come in and exploit China's cheap labor. Working 16 hours a day in a factory is far better than starving to death. Companies flooded into China, and economic zones such as Shenzhen and Shanghai became some of the wealthiest cities in the entire world. In 40 years, China's GDP rose from $191 billion to almost $15 trillion. It literally became the factory of the world. It manufactures everything from cheap clothes to advanced tech such as iPhones. Despite the tension between China and the US, the United States is its largest trade partner. It exports almost $500 billion worth of goods to the United States, and the EU its second largest partner. While $15 trillion GDP looks so huge, China's GDP per capita is lower than you might think. It's around $10,000, making it a developing country like Russia or Turkey. It still has a long way to go if you compare it to advanced economies like Germany, Japan, or the United States. One of the main challenges any developing country faces is the middle income trap. It's a situation where a nation becomes so wealthy enough that where workers become so wealthy as well. Naturally, they will demand higher wages. Higher wages makes manufacturing goods more expensive, and suddenly the country will lose its competitive advantage of being a cheap manufacturer. So the corporations that initially came to China for cheap labor will pack their bags and move somewhere else, where the cost of labor is still affordable. Just a few days ago, Bloomberg reported that Apple plans to start making the iPhone 14 in India, about 2 months after it's released out of China. The company has been working with suppliers to ramp up manufacturing in India, and the first iPhone 14s from the country are likely to be finished in late October or November. India is where China was back in 1990s, and it's investing in the infrastructure that will allow companies to easily move their manufacturing to India. Why pay higher wages when you can do that in India for a fraction of the price? Apple is not alone. A study by the UBS Evidence Lab found that a staggering 76% of the US companies with factories in China were in the process of moving operations to other countries in 2020. That includes brands such as Nike, Microsoft, Dell, Intel, and many more. The tension between the United States and China is rising. What would the United States' response be if China decided to invade Taiwan? Similar sanctions that it imposed on Russia? How will American companies continue functioning with such sanctions? That's why most of them plan to relocate their plants. Even non-US companies such as Hyundai Motor Group have also taken steps to shift manufacturing away from China. The United States have been heavily investing in ASEAN. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations is a political and economic union of 10 member states in Southeast Asia, which the United States wants to use as an alternative for US companies to move to. After the West's severe sanctions over Russia, where international companies such as McDonald's and Starbucks had to sell their businesses for pennies, not a single country will risk staying in China. While it might seem like China is wealthy enough to survive on its own without Western companies, look, China is producing smartphones, electric cars, and drones. It can compete with the US. Unfortunately, that is not entirely true. While some Chinese companies have seen great successes like BYD or Huawei, they depend highly on American companies for their components. Take Huawei. The company was growing so fast that it almost overtook Samsung and Apple as the largest smartphone seller in the world. But something went wrong in 2019 when the United States imposed sanctions on the company. Despite Huawei's technological might, it highly depended on semiconductors, the most important component in a smartphone. And if you take a look at the companies that dominate this sector, they're all Americans. Think of Nvidia, Intel, Qualcomm, Broadcom, AMD, etc. The other three companies that are not US companies, such as TSMC, ASML, or Samsung, highly depend on American companies such as Cadence or Synopsys to design their chips. That's why after American sanctions, the company is barely surviving. How China will escape the middle-class trap and develop new technologies without relying on the West is a challenge that China will have to overcome over the next decade. Will it be able to do that once most of the US companies will leave the country is another big question. But that's just one part of the problem. China's two largest trade partners are about to get into a recession. Without Russian gas, investors are so worried that the EU will go through a rough financial crisis and are selling off their euros to the point where the euro hits all-time low. Without the required energy, factories will have to shut down, which many already did in Germany, leading to higher unemployment and lower demand. The United States is going through a crisis of its own. Since the beginning of the year, the Fed has been raising the rates, pushing experts to anticipate a recession. I mean, the US is already in a recession. But what does that have to do with China? A financial crisis leading to lower demand in its top two largest trade partners is a disaster for a country that's highly dependent on exports. If this was the only problem, it wouldn't be a big deal, but since China is on the brink of a housing catastrophe and banks are running out of cash, the combination of all of these factors is likely to push the economy into a serious financial crisis. Thanks for watching, and until next time.